morning Vanessa Whitfield realized her marriage was over, she was standing at the kitchen sink washing dishes that weren't even dirty. She had washed them the night before, stacked them neatly in the cabinet, and sometime before dawn she had taken them all back out again without noticing, moving on autopilot, the way she had learned to move through most of her days on the Whitfield farm. Outside the window, the fields stretched long and gold under the early light, dew still sitting heavy on the grass, and somewhere past the tree line she could hear the sound of Carl's tractor starting up. It was a Monday. Travis had told her he'd be back from town by Sunday evening. It was now past 7 in the morning on Monday, and his truck was not in the driveway. She dried her hands on the dish towel hanging from the oven handle, a faded yellow cloth with small embroidered sunflowers that she had brought from her mother's house when she first moved onto the property. And she stood very still for a moment, listening to the sound of the farm waking up around her, the chickens in the side yard, the low creak of the porch boards as the wind moved through, the distant hum of the tractor getting farther away. Everything familiar, everything exactly as it had always been. And yet something sat in the center of her chest that morning like a stone she could not swallow and could not put down. Vanessa was 37 years old and had lived on this farm for 15 years. She had come here as a young woman who knew how to work hard and ask few questions, and those two qualities had served her well in the Whitfield household. Maybe too well, she sometimes thought. She had learned the rhythms of the property, the way you learn the layout of a house in the dark. Slowly, by feel, making note of every corner and sharp edge without ever turning on the light. She knew which fields produced more in a wet spring and which ones drained poorly after heavy rain. She knew the going price per acre for the county, which had climbed steadily over the past several years. She knew exactly how much was sitting in the farm's joint savings account because she was the one who reconciled the statements every month, a task that had fallen to her quietly, almost by accident, in the early years of the marriage, when Travis had handed her a folder of papers one evening and said he hated dealing with numbers. She had taken the folder without a word and never given it back. What Travis had never asked, and what she had never offered, was how well she actually understood what she was reading. It was easier that way. In the Whitfield household, competence in a woman was tolerated when it was useful, and ignored when it was inconvenient. And Vanessa had understood that arrangement from the very first Thanksgiving she spent at that table, watching Norma Jean refill the men's glasses without being asked, while a conversation about land prices moved right past her as if she weren't in the room. Vanessa had filed that image away somewhere quiet inside herself, the way she filed away a lot of things, not with bitterness exactly, but with the careful attention of someone who has learned that information is the only currency that truly belongs to you. She poured herself a cup of coffee and carried it out to the back porch. The air smelled like cut grass and something faintly metallic, the way it always did before the heat of the day settled in. She sat down in the wooden chair she always sat in, the one with the slight wobble in the left rear leg that Travis had promised to fix for 2 years, and she looked out at the land. Hundreds of acres of it, corn mostly, and some pasture to the east, where Carl ran a small herd of cattle. There was a pond at the far edge of the property that froze solid every January, and in the summer the light hit it in the late afternoon in a way that made it look like something out of a painting. She had loved this land once. She wasn't sure anymore whether what she felt for it now was love or something closer to grief. Travis had changed gradually, the way seasons change, so slowly that you almost convince yourself nothing is different until one morning you realize the leaves are gone, and you can't remember exactly when they fell. In the early years, he had been attentive in the uncomplicated way of a man who is happy with his life. He brought her coffee before she was out of bed. He saved the last of whatever she had cooked because he knew she forgot to eat when she was busy. He fell asleep with his hand resting on her side of the mattress. She had loved him then with the straightforward certainty of someone who has never had reason to doubt. But somewhere around the 5th or 6th year of their marriage, she could never pinpoint exactly when, the texture of things had begun to shift. The trips to town started small. A Tuesday afternoon here, a Thursday morning there, always with a reason attached. A part needed for the equipment, a meeting with the co-op, a conversation with the bank. She hadn't questioned them. She was not, by nature, a woman who looked for trouble before it arrived on her doorstep. But the trips got longer. The reasons got thinner, and there was a new quality to his silences at the dinner table. Not the comfortable quiet of a tired man at the end of a long day, but something sealed, something that kept her at a distance she could not measure and had not been asked to cross. She had not said anything. She had grown up watching her mother absorb things in silence. Disappointments, suspicions, small humiliations, and she had absorbed the lesson along with everything else her mother had passed down to her without meaning to. The fear of being left alone on the wrong side of a door she couldn't open was older than her marriage and deeper than any argument she could have started. So she kept the accounts. She kept the house. She kept herself very still and very useful. And she told herself that stillness was the same as safety. The coffee had gone lukewarm in her hands when she heard the sound of gravel under tires and looked up to see Travis's truck coming down the long dirt road that led from the main road to the house. She watched it without moving. He parked, got out, and when he came around the front of the truck, she noticed the way he paused for just half a second when he saw her sitting there. A pause so small that another woman might have missed it entirely. Vanessa did not miss it. She had been cataloging pauses like that one for years. "Morning," he said, climbing the porch steps. "Morning," she said. He went inside without another word, and she heard the sound of the shower running a few minutes later. She turned back to the fields and finished her coffee, and the stone in her chest sat exactly where it had been. Somewhere across the property, Carl's tractor made a wide turn at the end of a row and started back in the other direction, steady and unhurried, the way men who have always owned their land tend to move through it. That afternoon, while Travis slept, and Carl was still out on the equipment, Vanessa sat at the small desk in the room off the kitchen that served as a kind of home office. 3 metal filing cabinets, a computer that ran slowly, a printer that jammed if you weren't careful, and she opened the bottom drawer of the cabinet on the left. It was the drawer where she kept the older documents, deeds, original loan agreements, records from the early years of the farm's incorporation. She had organized them herself years ago in labeled folders with color-coded tabs, because that was the kind of thing she did without being asked and without expecting to be thanked. She pulled out a folder near the back and set it on the desk and opened it. She did not read it. She already knew what it said. She had read it many times over many years, quietly and without comment. She just sat there with her hand resting on the paper, feeling the particular weight of something that might matter very much someday. Then she closed the folder, put it back exactly where it had been, and went to start dinner. The following Wednesday, Norma Jean Whitfield arrived at the back door at 2:30 in the afternoon, the same way she always did. A light knock, 2 taps, then the sound of the screen door opening before Vanessa had even crossed the kitchen to answer it. That was their way. It had been their way for as long as Vanessa could remember, ever since the early years of the marriage when Norma Jean had started dropping by on Wednesday afternoons with some excuse or another. A jar of preserved peaches, a cutting from her garden, a question about a recipe. And they had fallen into the habit of sitting together over coffee and whatever Vanessa had baked that week, talking about small things mostly. The kind of conversation that doesn't go anywhere in particular, but leaves you feeling less alone when it's over. Norma Jean was 68 years old and carried herself with the particular dignity of a woman who had weathered a great deal without ever making a public display of it. She was not a tall woman, but she had a straightness to her spine that made her seem taller than she was, and her hair, gone fully silver since her early 60s, was always pinned back neatly at the nape of her neck. She had kind eyes, genuinely kind, the kind that noticed things, and hands that showed every year of the work she had put into this land and this family. Vanessa had always felt more comfortable with Norma Jean than with most people. There was an understanding between them that had never needed to be spoken out loud. That Wednesday, however, something was different from the moment Norma Jean stepped through the door. She was quieter than usual. She set down the small dish she had brought, a peach pie, still faintly warm, wrapped in a clean cloth, and she accepted the cup of coffee Vanessa poured for her, and she sat down at the kitchen table, and for almost a full minute she just looked at the surface of her coffee without saying anything. Vanessa sat across from her and waited. She had learned a long time ago not to rush Norma Jean when she had something on her mind. "That pie looks beautiful," Vanessa said, to give her something easy to step off from. Norma Jean looked up and smiled, but the smile didn't quite reach her eyes. "It's your recipe," she said. "I just followed what you wrote down for me." Vanessa cut 2 slices and set one in front of each of them, and they ate in the kind of silence that is comfortable between people who trust each other. Except that this particular silence had an edge to it that Vanessa could feel without being able to name. The kitchen smelled like coffee and warm peaches, and the faint earthy scent that always drifted in through the window screen when the fields were dry. Outside, a pair of mockingbirds were arguing in the oak tree near the fence line. Norma Jean put down her fork and folded her hands on the table, and when she looked at Vanessa this time, there was something in her expression that Vanessa had never seen there before. Not quite fear, something more resolved than fear. The look of a person who has made a decision that costs them something and is not going back on it. "I need to tell you something," Norma Jean said, "and I need you to let me get through all of it before you say anything." Vanessa set her own fork down slowly. "All right," she said. Norma Jean took a breath that was steadier than it should have been for what she was about to say. She explained in a low and careful voice that 2 evenings ago she had gone to bring Carl his evening coffee in the office, the small room at the back of the main house where he kept his files and his old farm ledgers. And she had heard voices before she reached the door. She had stopped in the hallway. She had not meant to listen, but the words had come through the gap in the door with a clarity that left no room for misunderstanding. Travis and Carl had been talking about the farm, about the accounts, about a plan to move the majority of the property's assets. The land deeds on the eastern parcel, the savings account tied to the farm's operating fund, and a separate savings account that Vanessa had never been given direct access to, one that had been accumulating quietly for years. Into Carl's name alone, before any legal proceedings were initiated. The word Travis had used, according to Norma Jean, was clean. He wanted to make things clean before anything became official. Vanessa sat very still. The kitchen felt suddenly smaller, the walls closer together, the air a little harder to pull in. She thought of the folder in the bottom drawer of the filing cabinet. She thought of the way Travis had paused on the porch steps Monday morning. She thought of her mother sitting at a kitchen table not entirely unlike this one, absorbing something she had decided not to name out loud. "How long have they been planning this?" Vanessa asked. Her voice came out steadier than she expected. "I don't know," Norma Jean said. I only heard that one conversation. But the way they were talking, the way Carl was listing things out, it didn't sound like the beginning of a plan. It sounded like a plan that was almost ready. Vanessa looked down at her plate. The slice of pie sat mostly untouched, the filling still glistening at the edges. She thought about asking Norma Jean why she was telling her this, why she was sitting across from her at this table instead of in her own kitchen, pretending she hadn't heard anything, but she didn't ask, because some part of her already understood. Some part of her had always understood, in the way that women who pay close attention to the people around them tend to understand things before they are explained. "I had a first marriage," Norma Jean said quietly, as if she had heard the unasked question. "Before Carl, did you know that?" Vanessa looked up. "No," she said. "I didn't." Norma Jean nodded slowly, her eyes somewhere past Vanessa's shoulder, somewhere in a room neither of them was sitting in. "I was 24. His name was Robert. We had a small house and a little bit of land, nothing like this place, but it was ours, or I thought it was ours. When things fell apart, I found out that most of what I believed was in both our names had been moved quietly into his family's name over the years. By the time I talked to anyone about it, there was almost nothing left to fight for." She paused. "I didn't know you could fight for it. Nobody told me that was something I was allowed to do." The mockingbirds had gone quiet outside. The refrigerator hummed in the corner of the kitchen. "I'm not telling you this to make trouble," Norma Jean continued. She brought her eyes back to Vanessa's face, and they were dry, but not without feeling. "I'm telling you because I have sat across from you at this table for 15 years, and I know what kind of woman you are, and you deserve to have someone tell you the truth before it's too late to do anything about it." She reached across the table and put her hand over Vanessa's for just a moment. A brief, solid pressure, the kind that says more than most sentences can. "There's a woman in the next county over who handles exactly this kind of situation. A lawyer. I've heard her name from 2 different people who said she was the real thing. I can write the name down for you if you want it." Vanessa did not say yes right away. She sat with it for a moment, feeling the weight of what had just shifted in the room. The way a door opens sometimes, not with a bang, but with just the softest click. And everything on the other side of it is different from what you thought it was going to be. "Write it down," she said. Norma Jean reached into the pocket of her cardigan and produced a small folded piece of paper that she set on the table between them. Vanessa understood, without needing it said, that Norma Jean had written it down before she came, that she had driven over here this afternoon already knowing what she was going to say, already committed to it, already carrying the cost of it in that straightened spine and that resolved expression. "Nobody can know I told you this," Norma Jean said. "Not Travis, and not Carl." "I understand," Vanessa said. Norma Jean picked up her fork and cut a small piece of pie and put it in her mouth. And for a moment, she was just a woman eating pie at a kitchen table. Then she looked up, and something almost like lightness moved across her face. "You know," she said, "this filling is something else. You could sell this, and people would drive a long way to buy it." Vanessa looked at her for a moment, and then looked down at the pie. It was a small comment, an ordinary comment, the kind that gets lost between other sentences on any regular afternoon. But something about it lodged itself in Vanessa's mind in a way she couldn't explain, like a word you hear for the first time and suddenly start noticing everywhere. She didn't know yet what to do with it. She just let it settle somewhere quiet and kept it there. After Norma Jean left, Vanessa stood at the kitchen sink and looked out the window at the same field she had looked at that morning, and the morning before that, and the morning before that. Then she opened the small, folded piece of paper. Written in Norma Jean's careful cursive, in blue ink, were 2 words and a phone number. Amber Simmons. Vanessa folded the paper again and slipped it into the pocket of her jeans, and she stood there for a long moment, listening to the farm settle into the late afternoon quiet. Then she went to the filing cabinet in the office, opened the bottom left drawer, and this time she did not just rest her hand on the folder. She took it out, sat down at the desk, and began to read. She did not call Amber Simmons that night. She did not call her the next day either. For 4 days after Norma Jean's visit, Vanessa moved through the house and the farm the way she always had, cooking, cleaning, tending the garden, pulling the monthly bank statements from the printer, and recording the figures in the ledger she kept in the second drawer of the desk. And she said nothing, changed nothing, gave Travis no reason to look at her differently than he had been looking at her for years, which was to say, barely at all. Those 4 days were some of the hardest of her life, and no one around her could have known it. The difficulty was not the anger, though the anger was there, sitting low and steady beneath everything she did, like the hum of the refrigerator, constant enough that she had almost stopped hearing it. The difficulty was the fear, the same fear that had kept her quiet for years, that had taught her to make herself small and useful rather than visible and demanding. The fear had a voice she knew well, and in those 4 days it spoke to her clearly. You have nothing of your own. You have no income, no savings account in your name only, no career you left behind that you could return to. You have the clothes in this closet and the knowledge in your head. And if you pull on this thread and the wrong thing unravels, you will be standing in the middle of all of it with nothing to hold on to. But there was another voice now, and it was quieter but steadier, and it sounded, if she was honest with herself, a little like Norma Jean. It said, "You have been reading every document that has passed through this house for 15 years. It said, you know exactly what is in that bottom drawer. It said, information is the only currency that truly belongs to you, and you have been saving it longer than you realize." On the 5th day, a Sunday, Travis left after breakfast saying he was going to meet a man about some equipment parts on the other side of the county. He said he'd be back by dinner. Vanessa nodded and refilled his coffee cup and watched his truck disappear down the dirt road. And then she went inside, picked up her cell phone, and dialed the number on the small folded piece of paper she had been carrying in her jeans pocket for 5 days. The phone rang 3 times. Then a woman's voice answered, professional and unhurried, the kind of voice that has heard difficult things before and does not flinch at them. "This is Amber Simmons." Vanessa sat down at the kitchen table. She had rehearsed what she was going to say, but the rehearsed version dissolved the moment she heard another person's voice on the line, and what came out instead was simpler and more true. "My name is Vanessa. I think my husband and his father are planning to move assets out of our marriage before they file for divorce. I think they're planning to do it soon, and I think I have documents that matter, but I don't know enough about the law to understand exactly how much." There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. Not the pause of someone caught off guard, but the pause of someone who is already thinking. "How soon can you come in?" Amber asked. They met the following Tuesday morning at a small office above a hardware store in a town about 40 minutes from the farm, far enough from the Whitfield property that Vanessa was unlikely to run into anyone she knew, which was exactly why she had asked about location before she agreed to the appointment. She had told Travis she was driving to see a friend from childhood who was passing through the area. He had not asked which friend. Amber Simmons was a woman in her mid-40s with short dark hair and reading glasses she kept pushing up her nose, and she had the particular quality of stillness that Vanessa associated with people who have learned to listen before they speak. She shook Vanessa's hand, offered her a seat, poured 2 cups of coffee from a machine on the credenza behind her desk, and set a legal pad in front of her without making any of it feel like a procedure. She asked Vanessa to tell her everything from the beginning. Vanessa did. She talked for nearly an hour. She talked about the farm, about the accounts, about the years of reconciling statements and filing documents and reading contracts that nobody had ever asked her to sign because nobody had ever imagined she understood what they said. She talked about Travis's trips and the growing distance and the conversation Norma Jean had overheard in the office, and then she opened the canvas tote bag she had brought and placed on the desk, one by one, the documents she had pulled from the filing cabinet, the originals and the copies she had quietly made over the years, filed in a second set of folders she kept in a box at the back of the closet in the spare bedroom, behind 2 winter coats and a stack of old quilts. Amber put on her reading glasses and went through the papers slowly, without comment, turning pages with the careful attention of someone who knows exactly what she is looking for. After several minutes, she set down the last page and looked at Vanessa over the top of her glasses. "You said no one knows you've been keeping copies of these," Amber said. "No one," Vanessa confirmed, "and this deed here—" Amber placed her index finger on a document near the top of the pile. "You understand what this says? In your own words." Vanessa looked at the deed. It was one of the older ones, dated nearly 13 years ago, drawn up when a portion of the eastern pasture had been formally incorporated into the farm's operating structure. "It says the eastern parcel and the structures on it were registered jointly," she said. "In my name and Travis's name, both. Not in Carl's name. Not in the farm's corporate name. In ours." Amber nodded slowly. "Did Travis know this at the time?" "He signed it," Vanessa said. "Carl witnessed it. I think they both assumed that because I didn't bring it up. I hadn't understood what it meant." A silence settled over the office. Outside, the sound of the street below, a car passing, the distant bell of a door somewhere, made the room feel very separate from the rest of the world, sealed and quiet. Amber took off her glasses and set them on the desk and looked at Vanessa with the clear, level gaze of someone delivering information that is both good news and the beginning of something difficult. "Here is what I want you to understand," Amber said. "What you have brought me today is not nothing. In fact, it is considerably more than most people bring me in a situation like this. The joint registration on the eastern parcel alone significantly complicates any attempt to transfer those assets without your knowledge or consent. If they try to push this through the county recorder's office without you, there are legal mechanisms to stop it. But those mechanisms take time to put in place, and they need to be initiated before any transfer is recorded, not after." Vanessa felt something shift in her chest. Not the stone that had been sitting there, but something around it, something that had been pressing down on it from above. "How much time do we have?" "That depends on how far along their plan is," Amber said, "which is why I want to start moving on this immediately. I'm going to need you to bring me everything else you have, every statement, every ledger page, every scrap of paper that shows the history of this property's finances. I know that's a lot to ask." "I already have it organized," Vanessa said. Amber looked at her for a moment. Something that might have been the beginning of a smile crossed her face, though she kept it professional. "Of course you do," she said quietly. They spent another hour going through the details. What Amber would file, when, what it would mean, what Vanessa should and should not do in the days ahead. The most important instruction was also the hardest. Go home, act normal. Give them no reason to suspect that anything has changed. Do not confront Travis. Do not move money. Do not remove anything from the property that could later be characterized as concealment. Just go home and wait, and trust that the work was already in motion. Driving back to the farm that afternoon, Vanessa kept both hands on the wheel and the radio off. The fields on either side of the highway were full and green under the September sun, and she watched them pass without really seeing them. She was thinking about the spare bedroom closet, about the box behind the winter coats, about all the years she had filed papers and reconciled accounts, and quietly, carefully, without anyone asking her to, and without anyone knowing, she understood what she was doing. She had not done it with this moment in mind. She had done it out of habit, out of the same instinct for quiet order that had kept her functional in a house where she had slowly stopped feeling seen. But it had led here. And here, it turned out, was exactly where she needed it to be. When she pulled down the long dirt road toward the farmhouse, the sun was low and orange over the tree line, and Travis's truck was already back in the driveway. The porch light was on. Everything looked exactly the way it always looked at this hour on a Tuesday evening in early September. She sat in her car for a moment before getting out, her hands still on the wheel, breathing steadily. Then she reached into her bag, tucked the copy of the notes she had made during the meeting into the inner zip pocket where she kept her insurance card, and she got out of the car. She went inside. She hung up her keys. She started dinner. And if Travis noticed anything different about her that evening, he gave no sign of it, which told her, more clearly than anything else could have, exactly how invisible she had become to the man she had married. That invisibility, she was beginning to understand, was the very thing that was going to save her. The call came on a Thursday morning, 3 weeks after Vanessa's meeting with Amber Simmons. She was in the garden pulling the last of the summer squash when her phone buzzed in her apron pocket. She straightened up, pushed her hair back from her face, and looked at the screen. It was Amber. Vanessa glanced toward the barn, where she could hear Travis moving equipment around, and walked to the far end of the garden, past the tomato stakes and the low fence that separated the vegetable beds from the open yard, before she answered. "They filed the transfer paperwork yesterday afternoon," Amber said without preamble. Carl Whitfield attempted to record a deed transfer on the eastern parcel and a reassignment of the farm's primary savings account at the county recorder's office. Both were flagged this morning. Vanessa's hand tightened around the phone. "Flagged how?" "Because I filed a precautionary legal hold on both assets 2 weeks ago," Amber said. "The moment their paperwork hit the recorder's desk, it triggered the hold. Nothing went through. The transfer is frozen." A brief pause. "Vanessa, I need you to listen carefully. This is good news, but it is also the moment where things are going to move quickly. Carl will find out about the hold today, probably before noon. Travis will know by tonight. I need you to be prepared for that." Vanessa stood at the edge of the garden and looked out at the fields. The morning was cool and clear, the sky a pale blue that deepened toward the horizon, and the land lay quiet and golden around her in the early light. She had looked at this view 10,000 times. She looked at it now like someone memorizing something before a long journey. "What does prepared mean exactly?" she asked. "It means stay calm. It means do not engage in any argument about finances, about the property, about any of it. If Travis or Carl confronts you, you tell them your attorney is handling your correspondence on those matters, and that they are welcome to have their attorney contact mine. That's all you say, nothing more." "And if Travis wants to know who my attorney is?" "He'll find out through proper channels," Amber said. "That's how this works now. You are no longer handling this alone." After she hung up, Vanessa stood in the garden for a moment longer than she needed to. A red-tailed hawk was circling slowly over the far field, riding a thermal in long, patient loops. She watched it until it drifted past the tree line and out of sight. Then she put her phone back in her apron pocket and went inside to wash her hands. She did not have to wait until evening. By early afternoon, Carl's truck was parked in front of the house. Not an unusual thing in itself, since Carl came and went from the property as he pleased, this being his land in every way he had ever allowed himself to think about it. But the way he came through the back door without knocking, which he never did, told her everything about the temperature of what was coming. He was a big man, Carl Whitfield, broad through the shoulders and thick in the hands, with a face that had been weathered by decades of outdoor work into something that looked more like geography than expression. He was not a cruel man, Vanessa had always believed that, not in the deliberate way of men who enjoy causing harm. But he was a man who had built something over the course of his life, and had organized every decision he had ever made around the preservation of that thing, and anyone or anything that threatened it became, in his mind, a problem to be managed rather than a person to be considered. He stood in the middle of her kitchen and looked at her with an expression that she recognized as the controlled version of something much less controlled underneath. "There's a legal hold on the farm accounts," he said. It was not a question. "I know," Vanessa said. She was standing at the counter, and she did not move away from it. "You want to tell me what you think you're doing?" "My attorney is handling my correspondence on those matters," she said. "If you have questions, your attorney is welcome to contact hers." The silence that followed was the kind that has weight and temperature. Carl looked at her for a long moment, and she could see him processing the sentence. Not just the words, but the fact that she had produced it so cleanly, without hesitation, without the flinch he had clearly expected. She watched something shift behind his eyes. Not anger exactly, though the anger was there. Something more unsettled than anger. The particular discomfort of a man who has built his understanding of a situation on an assumption that has just turned out to be wrong. "You've been talking to a lawyer," he said. "Your attorney can contact mine," Vanessa said again, in exactly the same tone. He left without saying anything else. She heard his truck start and the sound of gravel under his tires as he pulled away, and then the farm was quiet again. Just the wind through the window screen and the distant sound of a tractor somewhere on the property. She stood at the counter for a full minute after he left, both hands flat on the surface, breathing slowly and deliberately, the way Amber had told her to breathe when things got hard. Travis came home at 6:30 that evening. She knew from the way he closed the truck door, harder than necessary, not quite a slam, but close, that Carl had already talked to him. She had dinner on the table when he came in, the same as any other evening, and she sat across from him and passed him the bread basket and poured her own water and said nothing that was not ordinary. He lasted until the plates were half empty. "I got a call from Dad today," he said. "All right," she said. "He said there's a hold on the farm accounts." "I know," she said. Travis set his fork down. He looked at her across the table with an expression she had not seen on his face before. Or perhaps she had seen pieces of it at different times, and was only now seeing all of them assembled together. There was anger in it, yes, but underneath the anger was something that looked, if she was reading it correctly, uncomfortably close to guilt. The look of a man who has been caught doing something he knew, at some level, was not right, and is now trying to decide whether to apologize or attack, and has chosen, for the moment, to do neither. "How long have you been talking to an attorney?" he asked. "Your attorney can contact mine," she said. "Vanessa." His voice had an edge to it now, something that had always made her draw back before, recalibrate, soften whatever she was about to say. She noticed the old reflex move through her like a wave, and she let it pass without acting on it. "Travis," she said quietly, "I'm not going to discuss the details of a legal matter at the dinner table. If you want to talk about something else, I'm here." He pushed back from the table and went out to the porch, and she heard the creak of the wooden chair, the one with the wobble in the left rear leg that he had never fixed. And she sat alone at the table and finished her dinner in the particular silence of a woman who has stopped waiting for someone to come back through the door. She slept badly that night, which she had expected. Somewhere around 3 a.m, she gave up on sleep and went to sit at the kitchen table in the dark with a cup of tea, and she thought about all of it. The farm, the years, the folder in the filing cabinet, the folded piece of paper with Amber's name on it, the box behind the winter coats. She thought about her mother and the things her mother had absorbed in silence. She thought about Norma Jean at 30 years old, losing something she hadn't known she was allowed to fight for. And she thought about the pie. It was a strange thing to think about in the middle of the night, in the middle of all of this, but it kept coming back to her. Norma Jean's offhand comment that Wednesday afternoon said, with one foot already out the door, half serious and half not, "You could sell this, and people would drive a long way to buy it." It was such a small thing, a throwaway sentence. And yet, it had planted itself somewhere in the back of Vanessa's mind and quietly, without her permission, had started to grow. She had always been good in the kitchen. It was one of those facts about herself that she had never particularly examined. The way you don't examine the things that come naturally, she cooked the way she kept accounts, with precision and instinct working together, adjusting without measuring, knowing by feel when something needed more time or more heat, or a different balance of flavors. The peach filling in that pie had taken her years to get right. She knew exactly why it worked. And somewhere in the small hours of that September morning, sitting in her dark kitchen with the farm quiet around her, she let herself imagine, just for a moment, just to see what it felt like, what it would mean to build something of her own. Then she finished her tea, rinsed the cup, and went back to bed. There was still a great deal of work to get through before she would have the right to imagine anything. 2 weeks later, Amber called again. The legal process had been moving steadily through the county system, and the precautionary hold had been upheld at the first procedural hearing. The eastern parcel remained in both names. The savings account remained frozen pending resolution of the divorce proceedings, which Travis had formally initiated the previous week through his own attorney, a man named Gerald Foss, according to the paperwork, whose office was in the county seat, and whose name Amber had recognized immediately as someone who worked primarily with agricultural property disputes. He was good, Amber told Vanessa plainly, but the documentation Vanessa had provided put them in a strong position, and the joint deed on the eastern parcel was not something Gerald Foss was going to be able to explain away. "There's going to be a formal review at the county recorder's office," Amber told her. "Both parties will need to be present, along with their attorneys. Carl will be there as well, since his name is on the attempted transfer. It will not be pleasant, but it is necessary, and I want you there. I want you in that room." Vanessa thought about Carl standing in her kitchen, about the look on his face when she had given him the same sentence twice without flinching. "I'll be there," she said. The meeting at the county recorder's office was scheduled for a Tuesday morning in the second week of October, 6 weeks after Amber had filed the precautionary hold. Vanessa had been told to arrive at 9 o'clock, and she was there at 8:45, sitting in Amber's car in the parking lot with a cup of coffee she had bought at a gas station on the way over and had barely touched. The morning was cold in the particular way of early October in that part of the country. Not the brutal cold of January, but the first real cold of the season, the kind that reminds you that warmth is not a permanent condition. She was wearing a dark green blouse she had bought specifically for this occasion, something she had driven 40 minutes to purchase at a store where no one knew her, because she had wanted, for once, to walk into a room looking exactly like what she was, rather than what everyone around her had decided she must be. Amber came around to the passenger side and opened the door. "Ready?" she said. Vanessa got out of the car. "Yes," she said. And she meant it. The recorder's office was a low brick building set back from the main road, with a parking lot full of pickup trucks and a waiting area that smelled like old carpet and copy paper. A clerk led them down a short hallway to a conference room with a long table, fluorescent lighting, and a window that looked out onto a side street where a maple tree had gone entirely red overnight. Travis and Gerald Foss, his attorney, were already seated on one side of the table. Carl sat beside them, his large hands folded in front of him, his expression composed in the careful way of a man who has been told by his attorney to stay calm and is working hard at it. Travis looked up when Vanessa walked in. She had not seen him in 4 days. She had been staying at a motel in the neighboring town, an arrangement Amber had suggested once the formal proceedings began. And she was struck, as she sometimes was after a period of not seeing him, by how familiar his face still was to her. 15 years of marriage leave a particular kind of imprint. She looked at him steadily, and then looked away, not with hostility, but with the quiet resolve of a woman who has finished grieving something and is now simply moving through what comes after. Gerald Foss was a trim man in his early 60s with silver hair and a charcoal suit, and the well-maintained confidence of someone who wins cases regularly and expects to win this one. He greeted Amber with the professional courtesy of opposing counsel and arranged his papers in front of him with practiced efficiency. Carl did not look at Vanessa. Travis did, once, and then studied the surface of the table. The county recorder, a woman named Dorothy, presided over the meeting with the no-nonsense manner of someone who has seen every variety of property dispute the county has to offer, and is not interested in drama, only documentation. She opened by summarizing the situation in plain terms. An attempted deed transfer and account reassignment had been filed and subsequently frozen pending review of a competing legal claim. Both parties were present to provide documentation and testimony relevant to the determination of asset ownership and the validity of the attempted transfer. Gerald Foss spoke first. He presented the case that Carl Whitfield, as the original owner of record for the majority of the Whitfield farm, had both the right and the standing to restructure the property's assets as he saw fit, and that the joint registration on the eastern parcel had been a procedural matter from years prior that had been intended as a temporary arrangement and had never been formally updated to reflect the true ownership structure of the property. Vanessa listened to all of it, without moving. She kept her hands in her lap and her expression neutral, and she let Gerald Foss build his argument with the patient efficiency of a man who believes he is standing on solid ground. Then Amber spoke. She laid out the documentation with the same quiet thoroughness she had shown in her office the morning Vanessa first came to see her. The original joint deed on the eastern parcel, signed by Travis Whitfield and witnessed by Carl Whitfield 13 years prior. The farm's financial records showing consistent joint ownership designations across multiple documents over more than a decade. The timeline of the attempted transfer relative to the initiation of divorce proceedings, a sequence that Amber described, carefully and precisely, as a pattern of asset concealment that the court would be asked to evaluate in full. Then she placed one final document on the table. It was a copy of a letter from the farm's own accounting firm, dated 4 years prior, addressed to both Travis and Vanessa Whitfield, confirming their joint status as co-owners of record on the eastern parcel, and recommending they update their estate planning documents accordingly. The letter had been filed in the farm's records. It had been there the whole time. Gerald Foss looked at the letter. Vanessa watched him look at it. She watched the precise moment when the confidence in his posture recalibrated. Not collapsed, not dramatically, but shifted, the way a building shifts slightly in high wind. He picked up the letter and read it twice. Then he set it down and said nothing for a moment, and in that moment the room was very quiet. Carl broke the silence. His voice, when it came, was rougher than his attorney's, less controlled, carrying something underneath it that Gerald Foss's did not. "Where did the money in the savings account go?" he said. He was not looking at his attorney. He was looking directly at Vanessa, across the table, with the exasperated and genuinely bewildered expression of a man who cannot understand how a plan this carefully laid has come apart. The farm savings account. That money was supposed to be available for the transfer. Where is it? The room went still. Vanessa looked at Carl Whitfield across the conference table. She thought of all the years she had sat in that farmhouse reconciling accounts, while the men of that family moved through their days, presuming she was managing nothing more complicated than a grocery list. She thought of 15 years of folders and ledgers and quietly copied documents. She thought of her mother at a kitchen table, absorbing things in silence. She thought of Norma Jean, 24 years old and alone, losing something she didn't know she was allowed to fight for. And then, in the calm and level voice of a woman who has spent 15 years being underestimated and has decided, finally, to stop finding that useful, she said, "That's an interesting question to ask the woman you assumed didn't know how to read a contract." The silence that followed was a different kind of silence than any that had come before it. Gerald Foss set down his pen. Dorothy the recorder looked up from her notes. Travis, who had been staring at the table, raised his eyes. Carl stared at her. And for just a moment, the briefest, most unguarded moment, something moved across his face that was not anger and was not calculation. It was recognition. The recognition of a man who has built a story about someone for years and is only now, in this room, on this Tuesday morning, understanding that the story was wrong from the beginning. Amber placed her hand briefly on the table beside Vanessa's, the same gesture Norma Jean had made that Wednesday afternoon in the kitchen, over coffee and peach pie. And then she turned back to Dorothy and continued presenting the case. The formal resolution did not come that morning. It never does. That was something Amber had told her from the beginning, and Vanessa had believed her, and it was true. The recorders' meeting produced a recommendation that went to the family court judge handling the divorce proceedings, and that judge took 3 more months to issue a ruling. In that time, there were additional hearings and additional documents and phone calls that Vanessa took sitting in the small room of the motel, wrapped in a blanket with her notes spread out on the bed beside her. And there were nights when the fear came back in the dark, and she sat with it the way you sit with something you have learned you can survive. The ruling, when it came, awarded Vanessa a settlement that included her rightful share of the eastern parcel, a portion of the farm's liquid assets, including the savings account Carl had attempted to redirect, and a lump sum that Amber described as fair, and that Vanessa, who had been doing her own calculations for months, had already known was fair to within a few $100s. She signed the final papers on a Wednesday morning in January, sitting at Amber's desk with a cup of coffee and the particular feeling of a woman who has carried something very heavy for a very long time and has just, quietly, set it down. She found the space for the confeitaria. She had started thinking of it that way in her head, not as a bakery, but as something with a name and a character she was still inventing. In the town where Amber's office was, 2 blocks from the hardware store, in a small storefront that had been a flower shop and still had good light through the front windows in the morning. She signed the lease in February. She spent March painting the walls and sourcing equipment and testing recipes, working from 5 in the morning until her back ached and her feet were sore, and she went to bed tired in a way that felt completely different from the exhaustion she had known on the farm. Cleaner, somehow, more earned, more hers. She opened on the first Saturday of April. The peach pie was on the menu from day one. Norma Jean arrived 20 minutes before opening, carrying a small bunch of early daffodils she had cut from her garden, which had always produced daffodils earlier than anyone else's in the county. She stood in the middle of the shop and looked around at the pale yellow walls and the wooden tables and the display case with its careful rows of pastry, and her eyes went bright in a way that she made no effort to conceal. "It's just right," she said. "It's exactly right." They had coffee together at the table nearest the window, the two of them, while the morning light came in long and golden across the floor. And outside, the street was beginning to fill with the slow Saturday traffic of a small town waking up. It was the same ritual they had kept for 15 years. The two of them, a table, coffee, something sweet between them. Only everything around it had changed. There was nothing to hide here, no conversation to keep quiet, no information to protect, no careful management of what could be said and what had to be left in silence. Just two women at a table in the early morning, with good coffee and the smell of butter and sugar warm in the air around them. Norma Jean looked out the window for a moment, at the street, at the ordinary and unhurried movement of the world outside. Then she looked back at Vanessa, and she said the thing she had been carrying since that Wednesday afternoon in the farmhouse kitchen, the thing that had lived underneath everything else she had done and said since then. "I lost almost everything once," she said quietly. "And I spent a long time thinking that the only thing worse than losing it was watching someone else lose it the same way." She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. "I don't have to think that anymore." Vanessa looked at her, this woman who had walked into her kitchen one afternoon with a peach pie and a folded piece of paper and the courage to say what needed to be said. And she felt something in her chest open up in the way that things open when they have been held shut for a very long time. "Neither do I," she said. The first customer came through the door at 9 o'clock sharp. An older man in a canvas jacket who asked what she recommended and listened seriously when she told him, and then ordered a slice of the peach pie and a large coffee, and took a seat by the window and ate the whole thing slowly, the way people eat something they are genuinely tasting rather than just consuming. When he was done, he came back to the counter and said it was the best thing he had eaten in a long time, and asked if she'd be open next Saturday. "Every Saturday," Vanessa told him. He nodded, satisfied, and left. And she watched him go, and then she turned back to her kitchen. Her kitchen, her oven, her counter, her recipe, and she got back to work. If you watched all the way to the end, please leave a like and subscribe to the channel. It's a simple thing for you, but it means the world to me. Drop a comment below and let me know what you thought. Thank you so much for the company and the coffee. I'll see you in the next story.